I want to welcome everyone. Megan, let me just ask you this, because I'm up in the upper right-hand corner. Is that correct? I don't see myself full screen.
So in that, go to, sorry, have to click to the right screen here. So when you hover over it,
okay,
and you click the speaker view, or does it say gallery view?
I did speaker.
You'll want to spotlight Marianne. That will stabilize her image for everyone.
1 second. Sorry, with people coming in or trying to get everything. Here we go.
Okay, here we go.
We should be good now. Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. Well, first of all, let me just say, thanks in advance for the understanding about our continuing to be more facile with Zoom and all of this. I'm delighted to have Megan McCluskey working with us today. And I'll introduce her in just a second. But let me welcome all of you to this second Saturday conversation. And I have titled this year, sort of a broad title for this year, Going Home to Another Way. I know that in the Gospel of Matthew, the phrase is going home by another way. It describes Mary and Jesus and Joseph having to find a different route home because of the perils of Herod, and Herod being so concerned about a possible rival king. And so they are urged to go home by another way. And I find that a very evocative phrase, go home by another way. I'm also suggesting that we go home to another way. And that's part of what we're exploring this year. So I'm delighted to have you with us today. And Megan McCluskey, as I said, is been terrific about providing all the technical stuff today. And Megan, I'm so glad that you're here. And you want to say a little bit to us about how the morning is going to unfold?
Of course, good morning. I have to get my little script up. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have the slightly unsavory portion of the morning, just to remind everyone to please keep yourselves muted during throughout the morning and during the presentation, unless you're called upon. If you do have questions or comments, please direct them to the chat, which you can kind of find on the bottom up there of our screen, excuse me. And we will have a plenary at the end of the presentation with Jeff Creswell, our moderator. He will call upon you during that. So this will be a time to reflect on the thoughts and the ideas shared by Marianne this morning. If you would like to personally connect with Marianne, we're offering a coffee time from 11 to 11:15 after the presentation and the plenary. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation and the presentation, please direct them to the chat and keep yourselves muted unless you are called upon. Jeff Creswell and myself will be monitoring the chat section, and during the plenary, Jeff will call up on you to ask your question and share your thoughts, at which time you can unmute yourself. Thank you so much for your time and space, and enjoy the morning.
Okay, thanks so much, Megan. Appreciate that. As we get underway, two brief quotes. One from Van Morrison, who we just heard from. When heart is open, you will change, just like a flower slowly opening. When heart is open, you will change, just like a flower slowly opening. And from Paul's letter to the Philippians, this is from chapter 2. Therefore, my dear friends, continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. My dear friends, continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Today, I am going to explore Advent through the lens of some things that we've been talking about the last couple of sessions. Weak theology, strong theology, and what I tried to describe last time as an event. What is an event? So I want to look through the season of Advent through those apertures and to see if it'll give us a slightly different way of looking at and understanding the invitation and challenges of Advent. First of all, let me just say that Advent is a season in the liturgical year in the Christian church. There are a number of seasons. And by the way, one of the things that I so appreciate about the seasons in the church year is that they not only describe characteristics of the narrative that we follow, but they are also descriptive, I think, of not only the landscape of the narrative, but if you will, the inscape of our own lives. So I find that some of the themes in the various seasons during the church year reflect things that we as human beings struggle with, need to reflect upon, maybe can get some insight from, even from the very narratives of our tradition. So I think that's actually part of the genius of the Christian tradition, is the use of the seasons of the church year, how they reflect a landscape, but also an inscape. The season of Advent is a season of longing and hope. A season of longing and hope. And let me say at the outset that I think that we all basically long and hope for the same things. So I think that we're really, if we go down deep enough, that our longings or hopes are really very similar. What they might actually look like or how we think we will get to them, that may be another issue. But I think that we all share similar longings and hopes. Advent is the beginning of a new year in the Christian tradition. So this is our new year, Advent. And some have talked about, there are some themes in some of the texts that talk about the end of the world and how, you know, things are going to radically change, and this is this is the end, and then there's a whole new creation that's going to come. The only thing I want to caution about with that notion of the end of the world is that I don't think the tradition means the end of the world. I don't think Advent signals or talks about the end of the world. I think it rather talks about the end of world as we have known it. The end of world as we have known it. And it invites us to reimagine what is possible. What is possible in our world. In a way, the season of Advent calls us to reflect a little bit on what ails us in the world and what can we hope for in a future, and a hope that assures a future. What is a hope that can move us forward? Okay. So Advent invites us to reimagine what is possible and to see what kind of hope is to come. Now, Advent, it comes from a Latin word, which means to come. Okay? Now, Advent, or whatever is to come, all right, it's not some kind of magical intervention. And it's not an intervention that assures a certain outcome or even affirms a destiny, okay? So I don't think Advent is something that is foretold or foreknown. When Advent happens in our lives, it's like we do not know. We do not know until it comes. I suggest that Advent is an event. Okay? This is one of the ideas that we've been playing with, event, and I borrow shamelessly from John Caputo, who talks about event as sort of the stuff of possibility and hope. So I suggest that Advent and the season of Advent is an event. Something that comes to us and breaks into our world, disturbs us, maybe even shatters our horizons, something that comes in that we don't think is possible. We don't know it'll come. We don't know what's possible. We may think something is impossible until it comes and it's possible, okay? So event is something that is not of our making, but it is something that breaks into our world, into our lives, maybe even into our consciousness. Now, something about event is that event affirms that the deep structure of things is good, is very good. I mean, we get this from one of our creation stories, that the deep structure of things is good. So event is whatever affirms what is good in us or what is best in us. An event will evoke what is best from us, and it calls us beyond ourselves to do the good. Okay. Event addresses our deepest loves and desires. And I suggest that events open us, that they open us. They don't coerce. They invite, they beckon. Events open us. And I'd also like to suggest that an event is not only reflects our deep loves and desires, but that an event also desires us. That an event desires us. So there's kind of this lure and attraction between us and events. Now, an event, as I just hinted at, does not guarantee an outcome, because an event does not coerce. Hopefully it will insist, but it does not coerce. Let me also say that life, as we know, is uncertain. I mean, uncertainty is built into things. There is an indeterminacy in life. It's risky business. And we need to be able to cope with this. And I will go so far as to say that God copes with this also. That said, I think that event is our hope. The hope that history is open, that there are always possibilities, that event calls life good, that it affirms life unconditionally, come what may. And that God is the name of our hope. And that the name of God is an event. As I said, the an event does not coerce. It does not come to us by force or brute strength. But an event comes by a call that invokes or evokes or provokes. It's a call that calls us to say yes to life and yes to history, despite its tragic course. Event says, if you will, no to hopelessness and says, no, there's something beyond meaningless suffering. So event calls to us for hope for a future, a good future. And that, I suggest, is what we call the Messiah. A promise of something to come toward a future, toward a messianic age, if you will, okay? That the messianic age in which will be one in which goodwill can be realized and actualized and incarnated in the world, okay? An event, which I think I put Messiah in the category of event, calls us forward to a peace and joy without an army to defend it. Okay? As I've said before, hope doesn't demand a certain outcome, but trusts in the goodness of life. So if there's any sovereignty in event, it's not the kind of power we think of in the world today, but it's the sovereignty of goodness and beauty, if you will. Okay. Let's hope it works. So let me also say about call, that a call is only a call if it is heard. It's only a call if it is heard. And our response to a call is the only testimony. It's the only witness. So what I'm suggesting today is that Advent, it's a season in the church year, it means to come, but that Advent actually describes an event. It names our hope. It names everything we hope for. And I suggest that that hope is what we hope in the name of God. Okay? That Advent is an event that hopes for a good future. That is our hope. And I will go so far as to say that Jesus is also an event, in the way that I've been trying to describe it, okay? That Jesus is an event. So here we are in a season where we reflect a little on, what ails us, what is our hope, what is possible, and how might that come to be. And this is where I think the tension between weak and strong theology comes in. The way I've described event, I think event and weak theology, okay, the way that God works in the world is not coercive, it's for the good, that God affirms, that God is the goodness in us, that God is the goodness that is evoked in who we are, what we do in creation. There is a goodness deep, deep in the structure of all things. Okay? So I think that event and weak theology are actually one and the same. By the way, let me say about weak theology, we've talked about this before, that it hasn't really caught on. and the name weak theology isn't very attractive to many. Because we don't want to think that God is weak. And this is, in a way that we might think of as weak. Okay. What I like about the term weak theology is that it is so provocative. It is like, what do you mean weak theology? It kind of disturbs us. It's like, I don't get it. Or how can you say that about God? Or it gets us to think. It sort of turns things inside out a little bit. It suggests a reversal of a certain way of thinking. I think the Gospels do that all the time. So I rather like the term weak theology because it is so provocative. And it makes you ask the question, what do you mean by weak theology? Or how can you say that? So I think weak theology and event, the way I've been describing event today, are characteristically sort of one and the same. Now, we've also talked about weak theology and strong theology in some of our conversations, that the notion of strong theology, God is all victorious, that God is the decider, that only I can fix it. God is kind of a strong man, that the future is certain because God is going to make sure that it happens. God's ways aren't our ways. We really don't understand how this is working out, but that God is in charge and that God has a plan. And that we are assured a victory, that our destiny is, if we trust and believe in this God, that our destiny will be victorious. Right? That's kind of strong theology. Almighty God, everlasting. Okay? Weak theology suggests that God does not coerce, that God has an unconditional commitment and an unconditional realization of the goodness of things. And that should be our commitment to the unconditional goodness that is deep in life. And that weak theology does not have an army to enforce it. Weak theology I would say, is strong. In fact, I think last time I said, I think that only weak theology has the strength to save us. But it's not coercive. And in that, the hope of weak theology is the hope in goodness. And as I said, let's hope it works. Okay. So to talk now about the tension between strong and weak theology in the birth narratives. Okay, since this is Advent, this is a season that sort of moves us into the birth of Jesus, and that's part of the narrative and all that. So there are only two Gospels that have birth narratives. It's Matthew and Luke. Mark, which is our earliest Gospel, doesn't have a birth narrative, but Matthew and Luke do. But I want to just observe a couple of things about Matthew and Luke in terms of weak and strong theology. And by the way, they both talk about the coming of a Messiah, okay? The coming of hope, the coming of our future, okay? That there will be a future. Matthew traces the lineage of Jesus to the kings. So Matthew affirms that Jesus comes from a long line of kings, that Matthew emphasizes that Jesus is a new and perhaps very different king. It's than what the world assumes is king, but nevertheless, king is the primary image of Jesus in Matthew. And that in Matthew's gospel, it's the Magi, or they're often called kings, these wise leaders, these wise men who come, and they are the ones that first recognize and are witness to Jesus. It takes a king to recognize a king. Herod was horrified to hear that there was a rival king that had been born, okay? So he wanted to get rid of anyone that might be that. So Matthew talks about Jesus as king. And I affirm that Matthew will suggest that Jesus is not the kind of king that we think of in terms of, he's not a Herod, he's not a Caesar of this kind of the world. And even the Gospels sort of subvert the image of kingship. And that Jesus was executed as king of the Jews. And if God was really omnipotent and powerful, how did this happen? And so, but the play is with this notion of kingship. And I agree that the Gospels subvert the notion of kingship. However, I think it's really hard for us to think about Jesus as king, which is a really dominant image. Born a child, come thou long expected Jesus. By the way, I think Jesus was very unexpected, but come thou long unexpected Jesus, born a child and yet a king. Okay. So I think it's hard for us to think of king in a way that is not sovereign. And we might think, well, out with Caesar, but in with Jesus. Jesus is the right kind of king. His sovereignty is going to be the right kind of sovereignty. But I don't think that's what Jesus as king is about. So I think that the notion of king is the tricky one. It's very common. And one of our narratives affirms Jesus as king, okay, which has all of the glimmer of strong theology. So let's just keep that in mind. We talk about Jesus as king. The Gospel of Luke. Luke, the other gospel that has a birth narrative, traces Jesus' lineage back to the prophets and considers Jesus in the line of the prophetic tradition of Judaism. So he comes from a long line of those who speak the pathos of God, who talk about compassion and justice, and who speak to the marginalized and the hopeless. And Luke talks, the inaugural address of Jesus in Luke is, I've come to set the captive free. And, I'll bind up the brokenhearted and to give deliverance to the poor. And so in Luke, the primary image of Jesus is not of king, but of one who is with those who are not always accepted or acknowledged by the powers of the day. The first to witness the birth of Jesus in Luke are shepherds. Shepherds are the ones who, get the word that this wonderful thing has happened, that a child has been born. It comes to, shepherds were outcasts. They were marginalized in society. So for Jesus to appear to the shepherds as very distinct from a king, the kings in Matthew, it's like, no, Jesus comes to us who are of low estate, to borrow from a hymn of Mary's. And Jesus is often talked about more as a shepherd, that he will take them, he will go after even the lost sheep. He's of a very different order than a king, and shepherds lead from behind. So it's a very, very different kind of leadership. And he's considered more meek and lowly of heart. So I suggest that in the gospel stories and throughout the New Testament, there is this constant struggle and stress between a weak theology, God is compassionate, non-coercive, non-violent, God evokes, God doesn't, God, it's invitational. And that the call of God is indeed a call that needs to be heard and responded to. And then there's this other piece that moves through the narrative about Jesus as being triumphant, victorious, He's even conquered death, that if you, quote unquote, believe in Jesus or follow the way of Jesus, you too will be that kind of victor and conqueror. And quite a bit of the talk in the New Testament has to do with a new world, a new creation. We think of that as heaven, somewhere else than here. But so there are these tensions between weak theology, invitational, uncertain, suggestive, and a strong theology which assures us that all will be well, God has it in control. If we line up properly with God, we too will be saved. It is for sure. Okay? So I think that there is a tension between weak and strong theology throughout the New Testament. And I also think there's this tension in weak and strong theology in our own lives. I think we have a tendency to cherry pick a little bit. You know, we want the compassionate, merciful God who is accepting and won't be too hard on us. And we want to make sure that we've got this right and that we're going to end up okay. And that God will provide some kind of guarantee. Okay. So I think we struggle with this all the time. And well, let me tip my hand a little bit here. I suggest that in our day and age, that the tension between weak and strong theology, it's there. I mean, I'll be curious to see how you all respond to that. But I think that the stakes now are getting so high, the health of the planet, the survival of species, including ourselves. I think in some ways the stakes have never been higher for the sustainability of our world as we've known it. And I am not convinced that we can continue living in the tension of weak and strong theology. I think we're coming to a place where we need to really take seriously weak theology. Which way, how are we going to live? What do we really think is the hope and promise? Do we really think that weak theology, the goodness, the commitment to the goodness in life, come what may, in spite of our tragic histories, our continued commitment to the goodness of life, will that save us? I'm not sure we can have it both and anymore. I think we're coming to a time when we have to really reevaluate this. And I'm also going to tip my hat a little bit to something we'll talk about in the spring. I think Advent anticipates, with the themes I've been talking about, what the Palm Sunday story and the coming of Easter describes, which is that on Palm Sunday, there are two processions, and I'm deeply indebted to Marcus Borg for this. The story goes or history says that there were always two processions going into Jerusalem. One in the east gate is where Jesus came in on his donkey, a beast of burden, a burden, an animal that a woman would more likely ride than a male. Then on the west side of Jerusalem, Caesar would come in with his war horses to make sure that the peace was kept during a high festival time. So the story is that on Palm Sunday, that there are two processions. Jesus comes in on the east gate, weak theology. Caesar comes in on the east gate. Caesar comes in on the west gate, strong theology. And Marcus brilliantly asks us, what procession are you in? I think Advent asks us something similar. Where do we come out in terms of the Messiah as our hope? What does that hope look like? What is it going to be? What kind of future is to come? Okay. So I think that Advent, and these are sort of bookend themes. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to play 3 cuts for you from Handel's Messiah. And I think that in 3 fairly short cuts that maybe Handel's Messiah is going to illustrate for you what I've been trying to talk about for the last 30 minutes. And I'm going to start by playing a recitative. It's in part 2 of Handel's Messiah. That the words are, why do the nations so furiously rage together? And why do the people imagine a vain thing? Okay? Why do the nations so furiously rage together? That seems to be a perpetual question that we ask again and again and again. Why do we rage against the nations? Why do we rage against one another? I think that's a question that Advent asks as we come to the beginning of a new year, where we reassess what does ail us and what might move us toward a good future. Okay, so Megan, if you'd be so kind as to roll that up and have us listen to that recitative from Handel's Messiah, Why Do the Nations Rage So Furiously?
There's no sound.
Of the earth rise up, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed.
Okay. Thanks, Megan. So, why do the nations rage so furiously? Why do we rage so furiously against one another? To borrow from Rodney King, well, why can't we just get along? Okay. What's interesting to me about where this particular recitative is positioned in the Messiah is what comes just a little bit later, and from the same psalm. It's Psalm 2. It's that God will laugh all of these rebels to scorn, and it says, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. I'm reminded of John Lewis saying, don't become what you're fighting against. It almost sounds here like, why do the nations rage? We'll show them. We shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And then you know what follows that? The Hallelujah chorus. Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. Okay? The kingdom of this world is become the kingdom of our Lord, and Christ, he shall reign forever and ever. And then what is part of the Alleluia chorus, which we all know so well, is to affirm that God and Christ, that they are the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Okay. Megan, why don't you play that for us? I think you heard a little bit of the applause there too. It's like, you know, I mean, by the way, that was the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I mean, you know, just bring out all the stops. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, forever, forever. You know, it's like, yeah, you know, yeah, this is great. You know, it's seductive. It's assuring. It's powerful. It's powerful. And so in Handel's Messiah, and by the way, I love that work. I love it. But experience the triumphalism and I would dare say almost the militancy in this. That's strong theology, okay? And also in the Messiah, and as I've said, in the New Testament, there's also a very different way of describing the power of God and the power of Jesus. And I'm going to play, I'll have Megan play this for you in just a second, the beautiful air that says, and he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom and gently lead those who are with young. And then this lovely part, come unto him, all ye that labor. Come unto him that are heavy laden. He will give you rest. Take his yoke upon you, for he is meek and lowly of heart, and he shall find rest for you, and you shall find rest for your souls. Okay? What precedes this lovely aria is, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame man shall leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. So in this vision of Jesus as shepherd, or as one meek and lowly of heart, there's a suggestion here in the order of how the Messiah is put, that this is healing, that once our eyes are opened, when heart is open, you will change, just like a flower slowly opening. When heart is open, Van Morrison also says, you will meet your lover. So there's something about once our eyes are open, and once our ears are unstopped, we will begin to see and hear this in a very different way. I find that very moving, evocative, and this is where my hope is, okay? So yes, we just had the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, very triumphal, but now listen to this. And by the way, the young woman who's going to be singing this, she is indeed young. She kind of embodies for me a kind of vulnerability as well, which I think is kind of perfect for this. So Megan, do you want to play the next one for us? He shall feed his flock. A bit of an abrupt ending, but what's interesting about what follows this description of that has been attributed to Jesus is that he was also a man despised and rejected, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And I think this is also a really important insight about, quote unquote, the Messiah, about our hope, that God is truly with us in our human, all of the aspects of our human condition. And that Jesus is also a man who is acquainted with grief and sorrow. So And I think this also points to weak theology. Okay, so as we're in the season of Advent, what kind of hope do we imagine? I mean, what do we think is possible or even impossible until it comes? I want us to move into a plenary session now to give us an opportunity to share our thoughts or our responses to some of the things that I've said today, like that Advent is event. You know, what do you make of that? Advent is event. And that actually Messiah is event in the way I've been describing. And as I said, I borrow from John Caputo. That Jesus is event. And what you make of this tension between weak and strong theology. Where are we with this? Where is our hope? Okay. So and maybe some things I've said today have sort of provoked another thought that you might want to share, and that'll be great. So in preparation for this plenary time, I am going to, I do this every time, but I'm going to read listening guidelines from Listening Hearts Ministries. I think these are very helpful. I think they're hard to maintain, but I think that they reflect for us a kind of courtesy, a kind of hospitality for our listening and talking together. So Megan, if you could just put up the 10 guidelines and I'll read them aloud, but this way other people can follow along as I'm reading them. First, take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others with your entire self, your senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, and rational faculties. Don't interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what's been said. Don't formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only, expressing your own thoughts and your own feelings, referring to your own experiences. Avoid being hypothetical and steer away from broad generalizations, if possible. Don't challenge what others say. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who've not spoken aloud as well as to those who have. And generally give space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And finally, hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. Okay. So thanks to Listening Hearts Ministries, I think that these are, really helpful and good guidelines, and I commend them to you. They're also on our website. You can also get them. You can Google Listening Hearts Ministries, discerning listening guidelines, and get them. Okay. Jeff Creswell, who is a beloved friend of mine, and also is someone, he and his wife Carol, they do a lot of formation work themselves and a lot of work around practice and formation. So Jeff is going to help out with the plenary session. He's been paying attention to the chat room, and I think that's how we'll proceed. Jeff or Megan, whomever, do you want to say a little bit about how we'll move ahead with this?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Is that?
I can hear you, Jeff.
Good. Okay. Well, I can tell you, Marianne, there's a very, very lively discussion going on in the chat. So you have really, you've really gotten people thinking.
Well, good. And
so that's good.
That's, by the way, that's kind of my hope for these conversations, is that they'll spark other conversations, and that
yes.
Something will come up here that you may or may not quite agree with, but it'll encourage you to explore it some more, and in your own communities and with your own circles of intimacy. So thanks, Jeff, for that. I'm glad it stirred the pot a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll just say that there are enough comments here that there's no way that we can get to everyone's comment, but what I will do is I will just go through and pick a few out and invite those people to unmute themselves and then share their comment with you, so that you'll hear that comment directly from the person who wrote it instead of having me just read it from the chat. And then after you've been able to respond to that person, I'll have them mute again, and I'll choose another person and invite them to unmute and speak with you.
That sounds great. That's great. Thanks, Jeff. And we'll do the best that we can with this. Hi, Jeff. We'll do the best that we can. I'm going to ring a bell just to give us a minute to just settle ourselves and transition into this time of listening and giving word to our thoughts. Okay. So I'm going to ring the bell, and we'll be for just a minute. And at the end of that minute, I'll ring the bell again. And then Jeff, I will call on you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just take a deep breath and prepare ourselves for this time of listening and hearing one another to speech, to borrow from Nell Morton, and having some reflection time on what I've been talking about today. And Jeff, I know that there are a lot of comments, but do you want to start us off with a comment of your own?
Thank you, Marianne. I was thinking as you spoke about how this tension that you described between weak and strong theology it reminded me of a concept that I have learned from Parker Palmer. And he defines that as the tragic gap, which is that space that we live in between two seemingly conflicting opposites. And he says that the tragic gap it's a condition. It's not a problem to be overcome. It's not a case of having to make a choice of one or the other. It's a case of learning how to live creatively in the tension between the two, and that's the condition of being human. So that's what came to my mind.
Thank you, Jeff. And maybe that is that we have to live in that tension. Maybe we won't be able to go to quote unquote weak theology. We'll always be living in that tension. So as you know, here's hoping
Yes.
that the strength of weak theology will guide us into a good future.
And I would just say that I think that tragic gap is along a continuum. And I think sometimes it's probably necessary for us to move closer to one side than the other. And I hear you saying that perhaps we're in a time where we need to move closer to weak theology than we have been. So I'll begin by inviting Gail Weber to unmute herself. And she had a comment that I'd like her to share with you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, and thank you. I got to find my comments so I can read it. Can you hear me all right?
I sure can. Hi, Gail.
Hey, Marianne. What time was it? Okay, it was above all this.
Jeff might have it right in front of him. Do you have it right in front of you, Jeff?
I did, and then I went looking again and I lost it.
Anyway, Gail, what is it?
I hope it wasn't deleted.
No, it wasn't deleted. It was,
Okay. I was struggling, Marianne, with the dichotomy of weak versus strong and those particular words. I was hoping maybe we could talk about finding a different word for weak theology and maybe a different word for strong theology. The suggestion that came to my mind was invitational and commanding, but that's just a suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, granted, weak and strong theology has a, they both might sound a little flat-footed. And as I said, weak theology doesn't seem to have much currency. So, I invite people to think about this and maybe some alternatives that would be more helpful. So I get it, Gail. These are not easy, these are not easy terms to deal with. And strong theology, some might think that sounds positive, but others not. Weak theology does not sound positive for most people. But so, yeah,
that was kind of where I was going, like, weak theology needs a brand refresh, as they would say in the world.
Brand refresh, right. Just so long as it doesn't wear a purple robe, a discreet cloak and a purple robe. Well, good. No, I'm with you. I think this is a struggle. Thanks, Gail.
thank you, Gail. I'd like to invite Barbara Munster to share her comment. Barbara, are you there? If you can unmute yourself.
Myself. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, my concern is that I think one of the challenges we have today is to be able to hear amongst the clatter of, you can call it strong theology, but basically there is so much noise that we have to feel comfortable not only in the tension, but also in our inner self, that we can align with that which is creative, which has love, which flourishes our own soul. And so that means we have to identify very strongly with what makes us feel good and makes us feel alive. And sometimes that means you have to be anti, in a sense. You don't go near the strong stuff because you're kind of in a weak position, and you need to identify with other people, other likeness, so that you can get the courage to move on and stand tall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And part of the conviction of quote unquote weak theology is that we all have this goodness. And by the way, that's not a moral category, but that we all have this goodness, that there is goodness in creation. There is goodness in the world. And, I agree. We emotional contagion, negative emotional contagion is really hard we struggle with that too. And so how to continue to nurture a sense, and I dare say even a worldview that says that this is good. It's very good. Okay. So anyway, thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to invite Virginia Kennerly to unmute herself and share her comment.
Unmuting now.
Oh, good. There you are.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I like the weak theology idea, Marianne, or the category as such. I've always had great trouble with calling God Almighty in the liturgy, because he clearly has decided not to be Almighty. He's given us free will, after all. And more and more, I was preaching in the summer on the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. And what I came up with was, well, Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And I think God is still saying this, you give them something to eat. I will help you, but you produce something. And reflecting on that more recently with a friend, I just, this phrase came into my head. Without God, we cannot. Without us, God will not. And this was an email conversation. And I was on the train and he came back to me and said, that's a wonderful maxim, Virginia. I wonder who said it. I got home and I Googled it. And of course it was St. Augustine. But it's wonderful, isn't it? You know, without God, we cannot. Without us, God will not. And that is the weak God who requires us to be part of his being, that all may be good. And also just to say, I loved your evocation of Jesus coming in on the donkey, which of course is the weak theology. But then we get to Revelation and the so-called apocalypse, and Jesus is coming on a white charger. And that's the strong theology, which I have a lot of difficulty with. So that's all.
Good, good, good. Yeah. Thank you, Virginia, so much. And I do think that, I don't know why we keep saying that God is almighty and omniscient and all that, because frankly, his track record is not all that good.
Well, I don't know about, he probably is omniscient, but he's certainly not almighty.
Right. And when we think that he is, then it's amazing what kind of excuses we come up with to try to still have him be almighty, and yet these dastardly things happen in history.
Yes.
You know?
Yes,
So
right.
I just think that I appreciate what you're saying to, you know, really rethink this, reimagine this. And I'm with you that we are participants in and with God.
Yes. Thank you.
And you're you in Ireland?
Yes, I am. I'm in Dublin, Dorking,
Good.
where Marcus enjoyed being very much. And
Yes. I just
I'm in touch with John
to know that from far away as Dublin, that you are here with us today.
Oh, it's lovely. Lovely.
Yes, good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Brother Bill Bradley to share his comment.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just hearing the weak theology for the past couple sessions here with Marianne. It just made me think. I've been in recovery for a long time. I'm a friar who works with people in recovery here in North Central West Virginia. And it just made me think of the surrender to win that we tell people. And it's not to win a prize or win anything strong. It's to find grace. When you surrender into a weak theology, that is where we find grace. That's where I've found grace. And the people that I work with on a regular basis, that's where we find grace. And really, it's just surrender. It just came to mind. I don't have a big explanation or anything. It just hit me that way, and I'm glad to hear it put forth the way you've been talking about it.
Yeah.
It really made a lot of sense, and thank you.
Oh goodness, you're welcome. I'm glad it's, you know, I'm working this out myself. I'm glad it makes some sense. It's making sense to me too, and you know, this notion that if we reach a place where we have to be open, that grace will come. I mean, this is I think what is so startling is that, you know, to borrow a phrase, grace happens, and that we don't even have to. We can't grasp for it. And maybe this is where your notion of surrender comes in. You can't grasp it, but you can. But it will come. So anyway, and I think that the recovery program probably too is based in the strength and conviction of what I've been calling weak theology. Yeah, and it will save your life. Yeah. So anyway, thank you, Bill.
Thank you. How about Celia Carlson? Your comment about the color purple.
Oh, hi, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera set up. I didn't think I'd be talking at all in this, so I apologize for being completely unprepared. My little boy is the little boy from Aleppo in Syria. The comment I made about purple was simply that Marianne Borg had just said something about, the purple. And purple is the color of penitence for us, and here we are in Advent, a purple penitential season, but it's also the color of empire. So our very symbols are multivalent. They, can both refer to good and bad. And so it's just simply the fact of language that we live in that gap where words have multiple meanings. They can point to a good meaning or a bad meaning. And so we aren't ever going to be able to find a pure path out of that. So maybe what we're talking about by weak theology is really simply a humility, a recognition that we humans who live in language and wouldn't be human without it inhabit a symbolic system that we can never escape, and it's always ambiguous and multivalent. So I would think that humility is really what we're ultimately talking about here.
Well, I think that's really important. I so appreciate that. And let's pick up that thread too in following sessions, because you brought up a really important thing about language. That's a human expression, language, and multivalence. And this is where I think that hermeneutics, that fancy word for interpretation, that actually what we do, it's all interpretation. But how we interpret is really important. But that there will be that, things may be of ultimate concern for us, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily absolute. So anyway, I think what you're saying about language and purple being a penitential color and also the color of royalty or of empire, you've caught something that I think is really important about the nature of language and meaning and expression. And anyway, thank you for that. And let's, as Rachel Maddow would say, let's put a pin in that and explore that in future sessions. Thank you for that.
I would invite Evelyn to unmute herself and ask her question.
Thank you. I'm hoping, okay, there we are. Good morning, Marianne, and thank you so much for the invitation. My question was, how do we invite that shift or a shift in actual conversation from strong to weak theology when we're confronted by strong theology? And I'm thinking of a conversation that I had with someone who was sharing that a friend of hers had a young son who was very frightened of the COVID and being infected and all of that had impacted his life with his friends and school. And the mother's response was, "Don't worry, Jesus will take care of it all." And inside I just sort of shrank. And so how, or do we try to shift that conversation, or do we just simply listen with the weak theology of Christ?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's troubling, isn't it? That what we claim in the name of God. Well, I'm curious because you spoke with this person. Is that something you think you could have, quote unquote, argued?
I actually think I did start to. Instead, I hope that at some point that mother allows her son to express his grief, because grief is very real and fear is very real. And it's important not to shut people down, which is what I felt I was doing when I started shutting down what I thought was a theological understanding of, how we should accept illness in life.
Right. Yeah. There are some claims about, or assurances about Jesus or God for us that actually may be very, they help us cope, and they may actually be functional in some ways. But when somebody might be put in danger, I think it ups the ante in terms of, how do we deal with this? And also you're dealing with people's belief systems, which is very intimate and sometimes, it's tender. But I too am just flummoxed by things we claim in the name of God that actually are just not true. But, if your presence with her, just your care for her, would have spoken reams, regardless of what her belief system might be. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you. David from Nova Scotia, would you like to share your comment?
Sure, thank you. It was just an observation that Eric Law, who some people know from Kaleidoscope Institute and some of the anti-racism training, notes that there's the power dynamic between weak and strong, and that the paradox is that when Jesus is at his most vulnerable, i.e. on the cross, is the only time that Jesus is in fact the most powerful, when there is nothing left to lose except himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll certainly talk about the cross when we come into the narratives towards Lent and Easter. But what I think is so powerful about the cross is that Jesus, he risked his life for love. Love is a risk. Love is a risk. And he felt so strongly about, to use language I've been using today, goodness, and our goodness, God's goodness, whatever, that it's like, no, this I know is love. And I will risk my life for love. It's almost like whatever this love is, it's stronger than one individual life. I will risk for love. Wow, that I think is a powerful. That's kind of what the cross makes me think about. What we risk for love. And thank you. I'm not aware of the teachings that you've just referred to, so I really appreciate that. By the way, this is personal. I shouldn't do this in our time here. I know this is for coffee hour, but both my grandmothers were born in Nova Scotia. So I feel like I'm a little bit of a maritimer.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for your comment.
We've had a lot of lively back and forth with Diana Butler-Bass, and so I'd like to invite her to share a comment.
Lovely. Yes, we are blessed to have Diana Butler-Bass with us today, my dear.
Oh, thanks so much.
Diana.
See you, Marianne.
Hi, you too.
I hear Abby sitting next to you.
She is sitting next to me.
And I know she wants to either eat or go out because I recognize that sound.
Right. Abby is my dog, my four-legged beloved, to those who don't know. Abby is right here by my side. You're right. And Diana has Abby's brother. Anyway, yes, Diana.
I just really appreciate this today. You have me thinking about a lot of different trajectories of not only conversations we've had over the years, but also of my own work. And I do think really strongly that my whole sort of theological vision has been moving in this direction towards weak theology for quite some time without having the technical or philosophical background to that. So I really appreciate how you've introduced me to that, and that's a gift to me. But just the quick thing that I was sort of bringing up mostly in the comment section is one of my big worries is always these large theological terms in public discourse, and how we can introduce big ideas with very simple language. And so I sort of been playing, and this is, just for people to ruminate on, instead of weak and strong, although I love that contrast, I've been playing with the idea of a theology of vulnerability and a theology of victory. And I think that the term vulnerability has some cultural sort of panache that the word weak doesn't possess. And that kind of raises people's eyebrows. It's like, well, oh, what are you talking about? Rather than just, oh, I don't want a weak God. No, a vulnerable God. That's kind of interesting. Doesn't Brene Brown talk about that? You know, so anyway, I'm just kind of playing with that as a concept. And, you know, what it contrasts towards is what you've rightly pointed out as the strong, the almighty God, the God of imperial victory, all those kinds of things. And I actually don't think that we live between them. I think that the New Testament account is that vulnerability becomes the victory. That vulnerability swallows up imperial victory, and that it actually defeats it by subverting it with compassion and love. And so anyway, I don't think that this is something we live between. I think that a theology of victory or a strong theology or the imperial vision is always the temptation and the sin. And I think that what we see in the New Testament with Christ on the horse and lots of the frightening apocalyptic visions that show up even in the New Testament, that's always us giving in to our worst impulses. And our worst impulse is to turn everything into hierarchy and put Caesar back on Caesar's throne, even if all of a sudden our Caesar is named Jesus. And so those are just some thoughts that I was having. I thought you did a stunningly beautiful job, and I appreciate your friendship, and as a friend that you're also a constant teacher.
Oh, my dear. Thank you, Diana. That's very, I love you. I love you too.
And I miss you.
Yeah, I agreed. I love what you're saying. I love what it'll help us to continue to think about. I think too that the vulnerability in weak theology will, quote unquote, triumph, but not because it coerces, not because it's like, you know, ends up on top, as you were saying. It by its very goodness, hopefully it will out. And I want to share with you a definition of sin that I think I got this from Jack Caputo, which is that sin is ruined time. Isn't that an interesting thought? Ruined time. And I also think that evil is not about God. I think that evil is the malice in human beings that we all have to deal with. So anyway, I just want to throw those little things out and continue to put them in your hopper and come back to us and help us to think through some more. Okay. I'm really honored that you were with us today. Thanks, hon.
Marianne, I was thinking we might have time for one more comment, given the time.
Perfect. Yeah, we're getting close to 11 o'clock. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Debbie Brill, would you like to share your comment?
She's still here?
Yeah, I don't know.
I am.
There she is.
I am. Good morning. You surprised me. Madly trying to find my microphone button. Marianne, I want to say thank you so much for all of the thoughts shared this morning. I'm taking away quite a bit to think about. My comment was, when confronted by strong theology, Jesus will keep you safe. Perhaps asking a question that starts with, have you thought about, or my understanding is. Sharing a thought and being a presence of is a way to share that quote unquote weak theology. I love those terms. It's brought a light for me. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good. Well, let me say to those who were unable to be heard today, just thank you. Thank you for being with us and for engaging. And Jeff, I think that this way of doing plenary is really helpful. Maybe some people can make note of that in the chat room as well, that if this way of trying to do a plenary session, if you found it more helpful, let us know. But I so appreciate your reflections and being with us today. So good. We are getting close to, Jeff, anything you want to say at the end, since you've been seeing all these comments? Any closing word you want to say before I
would just say that I believe that this comment string is going to be part of the recording. And so there's a lot there for people to read outside of this time that I think people would find very interesting. We really just touched on a few of the things that were raised in the comments. They're very rich.
Okay, good. Well, carry on the conversation, people. Carry it on. This is, and just know that there are people near and far who are engaged in this conversation. And to borrow from that Jacques Brel song last time, no love, you're not alone. So our next session will be January 9th. And we're actually going to have, Diana Butler-Bass will be a guest with us. I am looking forward to that. In January, I think that Jarmo Tarki, my good friend, Lutheran pastor, he was a colleague and friend of Mark's. He's also been part of the West Star Jesus seminar folks. I think he'll be joining us, and we'll be doing a little dialoguing together. And so that will be fun. And I very much look forward to Jarmo being with us next time, January 9th. We will send out an invitation. And by the way, Carol, you are there for everyone to see, I think. Is that right? Anyway, hello, Carol. So that is, thank you. That is coming up January 9th. We will be sending out an invitation to you, and RSVP. Just a note that RSVP before the day of the event, because the day of the event, it'll say the session is closed. So we just need to have you RSVP before the, 2 days before the event, actually, because we will send out the link on January 8th, Friday, and then we'll send it out again on the morning of January 9th. So let me close with a brief quote. Actually, I'm going to read it twice, from Albert Schweitzer. This is from his book, The Search for the Historical Jesus. He wrote this when he was about 23 years old. And I love this quote. And perhaps in its own way, it speaks to some things we've been talking about today. He comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old by the lakeside. He came to those who knew him not. He speaks to us the same words, follow thou me, and sets us to the tasks which he has fulfilled for our time. He commands, and to those who obey him, whether they be wise or simple, he will reveal himself in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings, which they shall pass through in his fellowship. And as an ineffable mystery, they shall learn in their own experience who he is. He comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old by the lakeside. He came to those who knew him not. He speaks to us the same words, follow thou me, and sets to us the tasks which he has to fulfill for our time. He commands, I would say he invites, and to those who obey him, whether they be wise or simple, He will reveal himself in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings which they shall pass through in his fellowship. And as an ineffable mystery, they shall learn in their own experience who he is. I pray that we may come to know who he is. Please be safe, take good care of yourselves, be well. I'll look forward to seeing you in January. And remember that life is short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who traveled away with us. So be swift to love and make haste to be kind.